𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓷. In this video, I will explain Class 11th Political Science Chapter 9, which is Constitution as a living document. So basically in this chapter, we will try to understand how Constitution of India specifically acts as a living document. So in this chapter, we will see that even after 70 years of its coming into effect, the Constitution of India has remained intact even after having so many amendments. So in this chapter, we will look at the procedure of the amendments, how they are being laid down in the Constitution. Even after amendments, how the core values, the premises, basic framework of the Constitution have not changed. The contribution of judiciary in the evolution of the Constitution of India, and then we will see about the controversies, different aspects of the amendments in the Constitution. So we will try to look at how the Indian Constitution can be considered as a living document. So the name of the chapter is kind of what we have to prove in this chapter. So without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic. Are constitutions static? Now, as you know, it's not uncommon for any constitution of a country to be rewritten. There have been a lot of examples of countries like Soviet Union, France, Nepal that have rewritten their constitution more than once or twice. In fact, France had rewritten constitution 5 times. Now, the rewriting of constitution could be because of many reasons, because of upcoming of new ideas, opinions, or because of political upheavals. It could be for many reasons. For example, in France, earlier there was constitutional monarchy during the French Revolution. So in constitutional monarchy, there would be a constitution. But if the monarchy is completely reduced, if the monarchy is completely eliminated, then there would be only constitution. That means a new constitution would be needed, and again the constitution would be rewritten. And that's how France, because of political upheavals, had to rewrite the constitution 5 times. Similarly, in Soviet Union, before the disintegration in 1991, it had written constitution 4 times. And after disintegration, the Russian Federation had to write a new constitution. So it means that there have been a lot of countries which had to rewrite the whole constitution. That means bringing a new constitution. But there are countries which did not have the need to rewrite the constitution. A good example can be of India, and another could be the US. US is the oldest democracy in the world, which has a constitution of over 200 years with only 27 amendments, which is a big fact because even in India, if you look at, just in 70 years, there have been more than 100 amendments. Why India's constitution has not been written? That's also a big question. Is it because it's a perfect constitution which does not need any amendments, or is it because the constitution makers were so far-sighted that they could handle the future situations? Well, in a way, both are correct. The Indian Constitution is a very robust constitution, and the constitution makers were really far-sighted so that they could handle the future situations, so that the constitution would not have the need to be rewritten. But as you know, no constitution has been perfect. With the changing time, with changing circumstances, there has been a need for change. And the main focus behind the Indian Constitution have been 2 things. First is the necessity to seek modifications. That is, over the time, with modernization, with coming up of new ideas, with upliftment of the society, there would be, of course, the need of change in rules and regulations. That's why the first focus of the Constitution has been to seek the necessity of modification. Second, in actual practice of the Constitution, there has always been flexibility of interpretation. That is, the same provision of the Constitution could be interpreted differently by the judiciary or by the parliament. That means there have been a flexibility of interpretation between the different organizations, institutions of the government. Then again the next question comes, how a constitution is made. For any constitution to be written, one thing that would be in the constitution would be the reflection of the society, of the situation of the society at that time. And in India, it would be the partition, because at the writing of the constitution, when the constitution was being made, the partition was the biggest issue there. And that's why, you see, one feature of our constitution is that it is having a very rigid and flexible federalism. Why is it so? Because at that time there was partition, so the constitution makers had to make sure that again India would not have this kind of partition. That's why, two things are important in the constitution. First is that the situation of the society at that time would be reflected in the constitution, and second, the constitution makers of India made such changes, made such kind of provisions in the constitution that were durable in the future situations as well. So it is kind of dual role. First, reflecting the ideas, reflecting the situation of that time. Second, to deal with the situations in the future. That means it was kind of having most of the core values which could be dealt in the future upcoming time as well. Another thing is that if having this dual role, there could be two questions. Can the Constitution of India considered as an ordinary law which can be amended through a simple bill passing in the parliament? Or is it so sacred that it cannot be modified? And that's why the constitution makers made it to the between them. That means that it has been, the Constitution of India has been made above the ordinary law, so that the future generation would respect it well. And secondly, it seeks the necessity to seek modification, which means that with the changing time, there can be made some amendments in the Constitution, for which the procedures are laid in the Constitution itself. So it means that the constitution makers of India made the Constitution in such a way that over the years, at least in 100 years or 200 years, it would not have the change of all the Constitution. The Constitution would not have to be rewritten. And that's what we have seen. In more than 70 years, our constitution has remained intact with having its core values, and it is neither too rigid nor too flexible, having the characteristics of both rigidity and flexibility at the same time. Now, another thing is that about the amendments, how to amend the constitution. Now, how actually the Constitution of India can be amended. Now, this provision has been laid down in the Article 368 of the Indian Constitution. Article 368 of the Indian Constitution states that Parliament may, in exercise of its constituent power, amend by way of addition, variation, or repeal any part of this Constitution in accordance with the procedure laid in this article. So, Article 368 lays a provision, a procedure for the amendment of the Constitution. Now, amendment in the Constitution of India can be done in three ways. Now, these three ways are very important. First is in a simple manner, how an ordinary bill can be amended. That is simple majority laid in the Constitution, for example in any article. Second is a special majority which is laid in the Article 368. Third is a special majority with consent of the states. That is also laid down in the Article 368. Now, before understanding them, we should know that how the Constitution, why the Constitution of India is amended. As you already know that the Constitution makers of India wanted to strike a balance. Now, that balance could only be struck if the Constitution of India was rigid as at the same time flexible. Flexible means open to changes and rigid means resistant to changes. So that means that our Constitution is having rigidity as well as flexibility. It can have changes where it requires. At the same time, the main provisions of the Constitution constitution cannot be amended very easily. For example, if there is a change, if there is an amendment to be made in any part of the federal structure of the constitution, then that would be a little hard because it's a rigid part of the constitution. But if there has to be a little modification or little change in the constitution, that can be done by simple manner. So that means our constitution is not free of errors. That's what the constitution makers thought, because no constitution could be perfect, and that's why, to ensure that this constitution would remain intact in the upcoming time, that's why they made the provision of amendment laid down in the constitution itself. So now first type of amendment is the simple majority, which means that the simple majority, if 100 people are voting in Lok Sabha, then around 51 should be there in favor of that bill. For example, in Article 2, Article 2 gives power to Parliament to have any new state united in India. Now there is a very important term in that article, which is by law. Similarly, in Article 3 of the Constitution, it states that Parliament may by law amend, alter, diminish or increase the boundaries of any state. That means by law, which means that it has to be made in simple manner, because it's a constitutional amendment, but that will be done in simple majority manner without having special majority. So simple majority manner means that they have been laid down in the articles which have to go through that process to have been amended. So that means that simple majority has more than half of all the people taking part in voting for that bill. Now the second type of amendment that comes here is special majority. Now special majority is a bit different from the simple majority. In special majority, there are two things that need to be clarified. First is that of the total strength of that House of Parliament, at least majority of the people, that means more than 50% of the people, should be in favor of the bill. So if there are 545 members in Lok Sabha, that means at least 273 people should be in favor of that bill. Second condition is that of all the people taking part in voting from that house, at least 2/3 of the people should be in favor of that bill. Now why are there two conditions? Suppose if there are 545 members in Lok Sabha, that means 273 are needed in favor of that bill. Now suppose out of 545, 45 have abstained from voting. That means out of 500, 2/3, that means around 333 people should be in favor of that bill. So that means that if there is a ruling party in the country, of course it will be having majority in the Lok Sabha, which is that means that those 273 people will be from the ruling party. If the ruling party is initiating the change, that means if there is 2/3 majority of all the people taking part in voting, which means that not only the ruling party can have its opinion, it will have to negotiate with other parties as well, with all the political parties with having political consensus. So that means not a single party would have its power in the Lok Sabha. That is why special majority is having two conditions. First is having half, like majority of the total strength of that House of Parliament, and second, of all the people taking part in voting from that house, at least 2/3 should be in favor of that bill. So special majority is required from special provisions for some special amendments. Now the third type of amendment here is ratification by states. Now ratification by state, that means consent having at least half of the state legislatures. Now this provision, this type of amendment is only required if there has to be an amendment in the federal structure of the constitution. Suppose the parliament is initiating an amendment bill for the 7th schedule, which is having union list, state list and concurrent list, which is related to transfer of subjects. Now transfer of subjects, which is a federal part of the constitution. So if there is an amendment bill for that part of the constitution, that means it needs to have ratification by half of the state legislatures plus special majority in the parliament. So that means there will be simple procedure for special majority as just we have discussed, and after special majority, out of the 28 states, at least 14 states should be in favor of that bill. 14 state legislatures should be in favor of that bill. One more thing is that any amendment can only be initiated by the Parliament of India, not by any other organization or institution in the country. Why so? Because Parliament is having the people elected by the people of India. That means they are having the representatives of us. That is why they have the highest power in amendment. That is, only they can initiate the amendment in the country. And as you already know that lastly, if the bill is initiated, if it is passed in the parliament, then it has to go to the president to ask for his assent, as he is also a member of the parliament. But now if there is an amendment bill for the constitution, then the president does not have any power to ask for reconsideration or to return it to the parliament. The parliament is bound to sign that amendment bill if it is passed from the parliament. So that means that here the president does not have his power over the constitutional amendment, because parliament and state legislatures have the representatives elected by the people. That is why the final power is in them. So we have discussed about three types of amendments, three procedures of amendments. First is by simple majority, which is done so for amending the simple parts or those having little value in the constitution. Then comes the special majority, and third is special majority with ratification of half of the states, which can be done only for the amendment in the federal structure of the constitution of the country, which is laid in the constitution. And one more thing you should know, that there have been two principles which are dominating the whole world right now for the amendments in the constitution. One is the principle of special majority. That is, we have already discussed. Now somewhere it is 2/3 majority of the people taking participation in voting, and somewhere it is even 3/4 of all the people taking part in voting. For example, this kind of special majority has been adopted in countries such as India, US, Russia, South Africa. Now in South Africa and Russia, for some amendments, there should be 3/4 majority, 3/4 of the people of all the people taking participation. The second principle of amendment in the constitution is that people's participation in the amendment process, which is practically not possible in India, but in those countries which are having less population, very less population compared to India. For example, in Switzerland, people themselves can initiate an amendment. But if you look at the case of India, where there have been like more than billion people, then that means where can we get them together to have an amendment for the constitution? That's why it's only practically possible in those countries which are having less population. Switzerland and Russia are some of them. Now there comes another thing, that why have there been so many amendments in the Indian constitution? Now as of 2023, from the day the constitution was enacted in the country, which is 26 January 1950, there have been 106 amendment acts in the constitution, which means that there have been 106 amendments made to the constitution, though some of them have been repealed. So in such a short span of time, like in 70 years, how have there been so many amendments? Let us understand them by reading the two graphs that are given in your book. Now first graph tells us that in 10 years how many amendments in constitution took place, and the second graph tells us that for 10 amendments how many years it took. And from reading the two graphs, you will understand that from the period 1971 to 1991, there had been a lot of amendments in the Indian Constitution. As you already know that in 1975 there was emergency in the country, and after 1989 there had been coalitions in the country. And if you look at the second graph, you will understand that two periods between 1974 to 1976 and 2001 to 2003, there had been 10 amendments. In 3 years, 10 amendments. That means there have been a lot of amendments. Now first is the case when Congress was in the domination. As you already know that in 1990s Congress was in domination, and at that time Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of the country, and at the same time the emergency was in the country. So that means first case was the Congress domination, which had even 352 seats in the Lok Sabha and had most of the state assemblies as well. Second is the case of coalition. 2001 was a time period of coalitions, the rising of the upcoming of coalitions in the country, and at the same time we have seen about BJP and its rivalries with other political parties. So we can see that in these two brief periods there had been most of the amendments in the country, like 10 amendments in just 3 years. Though they were having different political circumstances, there has always been a criticism that in India there have been a lot of amendments in the Constitution, and they are mostly because of political circumstances or political power. But from reading these two data, you can see that the amendments are not just only because of political circumstances. There have been other factors as well, because over the time the circumstances are changing, and the Constitution that was written by reading the circumstances, the situation in 1940s cannot be same for in 21st century. That's why we have been making a lot of amendments in the Indian Constitution, and that is why there have been a lot of amendments in the Constitution. Now again a question arises that is the Indian Constitution so flexible that so many amendments can take place? So what are the contents of those amendments that are made in the Constitution? Let us try to understand them by the next topic, which is contents of amendments made so far. So what has been the contents of the amendment that have been made so far in the Indian Constitution? Is it because the Indian Constitution too flexible that there have been many amendments? Now the content of amendments can be categorized in 3 categories. First is of the amendment that are of administrative or technical nature. Second could be the amendments that have been because of differing interpretations. Third, because of political consensus. And fourth, we will study about the controversies of amendments, which is not directly a part of a category of amendments in the Constitution, but could be a part of the amendments. So first let us try to understand the amendments that are of technical or administrative nature. Now these amendments in the Constitution are of a very like little values. You could say that they are making some minor modifications or some kind of explanation, some kind of clarification to the given provision of the Constitution. That means they are not entirely changing that provision of the Constitution or replacing it with a new one. There have been some little modification to that particular provision of the Constitution. So it is kind of for the technical, for administrative purpose, there have been those amendments. For example, the 15th constitutional amendment was for the increase of retirement age for the judges of High Court from 60 years to 62 years. Now you see there has been only a little modification in this article, and that's why it's considered of a technical nature. That's not a big thing or a big issue in the country. Now another example could be the 55th Amendment, which was to increase the salaries of the judges of Supreme Court and the High Courts. So that is also of a technical or of administrative nature. Another example could be for the reservation of seats. The reservation of seats for the scheduled tribes, scheduled caste and OBCs was made only for 10 years. The constitution makers thought so that if there were reservation for 10 years, then there would be upliftment of those backward classes. But if there were not upliftment even in 10 years, then it could be increased. The duration of the reservation could be increased, and that is why amendments are made in the constitution to increase this time period. So if there has been from 1950 to 1960, then it will be increased from 1960 to 1970 by introducing an amendment when it is about to expire. So 104th Constitutional Amendment Act was also for this purpose, to increase the cessation of reservation of the SC, STs and other OBCs. You could say for backward classes. So that means in first category of amendments, all those amendments that are of technical nature, of administrative nature, or are having some very little to minute modification in the provision of the constitution without completely changing the meaning of it, are considered in the first one. Now the second type of amendment could be that have occurred because of differing interpretations. Now as you already know that there had been a lot of conflicts between the judiciary and the parliament in our country. Now even the interpretation of the constitution has been different in these two organs, in these two organizations of the country. You could say that as you know, in judiciary chapter we read that there had been 3 points in which the judiciary and parliament had conflicts. First was the fundamental rights versus DPSP. Second was the scope of right to private property, and third was the scope of amendment power to the parliament. So the parliament's power to amend the constitution, what was the scope of it, that was questioned by the judiciary, and judiciary was having different interpretation of the constitution than the parliament. Then what would happen if the judiciary released any interpretation of constitution's any provision? Then parliament would make an amendment for that particular provision of the constitution. Then again there would be interpretation from the judiciary, there would be again an amendment for that interpretation. So it was like long chain reaction chain that was created between the judiciary and the parliament, and that tensioned a lot between the 1970 to 1975. As you know that between that period there was emergency in the country, there were a lot of tensions going on in the country, and at that time in 1973 a very famous judgment of the Supreme Court came, which was of the 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓷's case. What was that? We'll try to understand that as well. And the closer look of this political history of the country, you will study about it in the 12th class. So you could say that the second type of amendment are those amendments that have occurred because of differing interpretation between the judiciary and the parliament. Though they could be because of having different interpretation between the executive. So second type of amendments are those amendments that have occurred because of differing interpretation between the judiciary and the parliament, which had been made a lot between the time period of 1970s to 1977. Now the third type of amendment are those because of political consensus that had increased a lot after 1984. Now as you know, after 1984, the rising of coalition government could be seen in the country. Before 1984, the Congress, Indian National Congress, had been in political domination. But after 1984, a lot of coalitions came up, and that is why political consensus came up as well. Amendments of political consensus means that those amendments that have been made for the aspirations of the society to prevalent the philosophy of the society, that means which were necessary, which were very important at that time in the country. So for example, you could say see the example of anti-defection law, which was also introduced by a constitutional amendment. Now anti-defection, which is something like if you contested an election from A party and after election you went to B party, that would be considered as defection, and it was because only of corruption, or it could be because of money, or it could be because of anything. And that is why, to reduce that provision, to reduce that practice, anti-defection law was introduced by constitutional amendment, by 59th and 91st constitutional amendment acts in the country. Thereafter, the reducing of age, voting age from 21 to 18, that was also through a constitutional amendment. So these are the things that everyone needed. There was not a benefit of a single particular political party. It's more like the aspirations of the people, or it could be to prevalent the philosophy at that time in the country. So the amendments that are because of political consensus, that means having all the people's opinion, or it could be at that time those amendments were really necessary. Now, another thing that comes in amendments is the controversy of amendments. It's not like all the amendments have been made in the constitution and there have been no controversy. There have been, mostly in the time period of 1970s to 1980s. Now, there have been particularly 3 amendments which have been in a lot of controversy, that are 38th, 39th and 42nd. In fact, 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was also considered as a mini constitution, as it changed a lot of provisions of the Indian Constitution. It was enacted in 1976. There had been a lot of conflicts between the judiciary and the parliament that was seemed to be resolved in the 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪's judgment case. In the 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪's case judgment, in 1973, the basic structure doctrine came up by the Supreme Court, and it was seemed by the people that the conflict between the judiciary and parliament would now be resolved. But again, in 1976, the parliament came up with a new amendment in the constitution which changed a lot of provision. First of them being that the duration of the Lok Sabha would be increased from 5 to 6 years. After that, the judicial review power of the judiciary had been restricted a lot. The basic structure doctrine was also kind of reduced in that amendment. A lot of provisions, around 53 articles of the Indian Constitution had been amended by that single constitutional amendment. So that means it was kind of a lot of changes had been made. Even in the preamble of the Constitution, there had been amended. Even in the preamble of the Constitution, there had been so many provisions amended, like new words, socialist and secular came up. So you could say that 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was considered as a mini constitution because of the changes, because of the amendments it made to the Constitution. Then, as you know, after 1977, when Indira Gandhi's government fell off, then the Janata Party's government came up and its leader was Morarji Desai. So when he became the Prime Minister, he repealed the 38th, 39th and 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act because they seemed void, because they seemed kind of abuse of powers, as judiciary's powers had been reduced, which was a part of basic structure. What is basic structure? We'll study about it more in the upcoming topics. So you could say that there are 3 types of amendments based on the contents. First is of technical or administrative nature. Second, which is because of differing interpretations. Third is because of political consensus. And the contents of the amendments, you could say that in some amendments it is only because of political scenario, like in 1970s cases. Those amendments were wholly based on political scenario of the country. Now the next topic here is basic structure and evolution of the Constitution. So basic structure and evolution of the Constitution. What exactly is this basic structure doctrine or theory? One thing that has a long impact on the evolution of the Constitution was the basic structure doctrine, which was given by the Supreme Court in the famous 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 case judgment of 1973. What exactly is this basic structure? In this judgment, the Supreme Court said that the Parliament had the power to amend all the parts of the Constitution except the basic structure of the Constitution. You know what it means? That you can change the Constitution, you can have amendments in the Constitution without changing its core points, without changing its main points, so that the Constitution, the main parts of the Constitution would remain intact. So in this doctrine, in this theory, in this judgment, the Supreme Court declared that the Parliament did not have power to make amendments in the basic structure of the Constitution. Secondly, the Parliament could change all the parts of the Constitution anytime, any part in any way, without except with limitation of basic structure doctrine. Thirdly, what will be in basic structure would be decided by the judiciary. That means if there is a case or if there is an amendment in any part of the Constitution, now some people are questioning its validity, saying that it's a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, then judiciary has the power to decide whether it is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution or not. So basically, what is inside basic structure is not clearly specified, but it can be decided by the judiciary in case of any case, in case of any upliftment, in case of any dissatisfaction among the people. So basically, the basic structure doctrine made a long way for the amendment of the Constitution. As you know, in 1976, one of the points in 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was against this amendment, against this judgment of the judiciary. You can say that without making an amendment to the Constitution, because only the Parliament has power to do so, the judiciary made a lot of changes in the amendment procedure of the Constitution. That means that with just judicial interpretation, a lot of changes were made in the Constitution. Some points like fundamental rights, like the independence of judiciary, the judicial review power of the judiciary, many points of the Constitution were included in the basic structure of the Constitution, even though in the Constitution there has been no mention of the basic structure. Secondly, we can say that the judicial interpretation of judiciary has been sometimes helpful too, like the introduction of creamy layer in the reservation of backward classes. Before, there was no concept of creamy layer. You know, the reservations have been made in the educational institutions and in many job opportunities for those who are not belonging to creamy layer. Creamy layer consists of those backward classes people who are already having good financial condition, having more than 8 lakh rupees per annum income. So those would be considered as a part of creamy layer and thus would not have benefits that regular or poor backward classes people have. And many judicial interpretation in many rights, in many fundamental rights, like right to educational institutions, right to life, right to minorities to establish educational institutions, in many rights there have been interpretation by the judiciary. So we can say that basic structure and judicial interpretation have made a very long way for the evolution of the Constitution without directly amending it. Even though the power is only to the Parliament, but even without amending the Constitution, the judiciary did a lot to the Constitution. Secondly, the next topic here is Constitution as a living document. So we have already called the Constitution as a living document. Why is it so? Let us see the philosophical point of view as well. You know, what is a living thing? Living thing is something that is responding to some situation, to some stimulus, which is what the Constitution has been doing as well. You know, over the years, the Constitution has responded to every situation that came in our country. Because in our country, there is rule of law rather than rule by law, which means that the Constitution has been responding to many situations that came over and went over. It also has a lot of experience. You could say that over the years many political parties came up, many political upheavals came up, many political leaders came up as the leaders of the country, but the constitution remained same. It was having experiences from different situations. So if in case same situation arises in future, it could be dealt with the constitution. So for example, you see, in emergency the constitution was there. Again, after that many changes were made in the emergency provision, so that if in future a similar case arises, it could be dealt with. So we can say that with those experiences, the constitution has been through a lot of evolution, and that's what it makes it a living document. So we can say that over the years, with many responses, with many experiences, the constitution is considered as one of the living documents in the world. And we can see it by other ways as well, like how it has been evolving, how it has changed over the years. Because why is constitution in the country? To have democratic politics. So has it been successful in getting that democratic politics in the country? Let us try to understand that aspect as well. You know, one of the biggest problem of the democratic politics in the country was the parliamentary supremacy of the 1950s, which was dealt in those decades. You know, parliamentary supremacy, because parliament is having representatives elected by the people. They are people's representatives. So why is it so that we are having the system of checks and balances, so that no organ of the government, be it parliament, judiciary or executive, not having more power than the other, they are checking and balancing each other? Because in a democracy, everything is not just about people's representatives. There has to be some institutions. Democracy is about limiting the arbitrary use of power, and that is why there has been a system of checks and balances. So we can say that parliamentary supremacy was not allowed by the Constitution of India, so that democracy could have been sustained for a longer time, and that has been made so. So we can say that constitution, just as a living being, has made our country, has made many changes to the country, has paved the way for the country. Now here the next topic is contribution of the judiciary. So let us now discuss what has been the contribution of judiciary in the evolution of the constitution. You know what? When there was controversy between the judiciary and the parliament always said that the parliament had the power to change, to amend the constitution for good intentions, for the welfare of the people, to seek help for the poor people, those who are backward from the society. Now at that time the statement of judiciary was that though you are having a good intention, even with good intention, pro-people measures should not bypass the legal measures. Even if you have good intention, you still have to go through the legal measures. You cannot bypass them, because for you it is a good intention, but it can be, for those who are abusing their power, it can be an excuse for the arbitrary use of power. That is why there had been a lot of controversies between the judiciary and the parliament that was resolved in the famous judgment of 1973 𝓒𝓱𝓪𝓷 case. You might be surprised to hear that even without having any kind of mention of basic structure in the constitution, the basic structure has been accepted by every organization in the country, organizations and institutions of the country. Why is it so? How has the judiciary been successful in making such a non-existent thing? Now, what judiciary answered was that though in constitution there were letters, but what is important is the intent behind writing those letters and words. We should not only find importance of those words and sentences, but behind those letters, what were the ideas of those writers, why they wrote so. That means not just letters are important, but the spirits of those letters are important as well, and that's what is included in the basic structure theory. That means the letters as well as the spirit of all those words and meanings have been included in the basic structure theory. So you can say that there have been a lot of judicial interpretation, there have been a lot of contribution of the judiciary in the evolution of the constitution. For example, a lot of times the judicial interpretation has helped as well. For example, earlier there could be reservation of seats for backward classes as much as they wanted. So what would a political party do? What would a ruling party do? To have their vote bank, they would from a particular community of the people, they would give them a lot of reservation. That's why through judicial interpretation, the judiciary limited it to 50%. That means in any organization, not more than 50% of the seats could be reserved for backward classes. So we can say that there has been a lot of contribution of the judiciary in the evolution of the constitution, and the most important of them has been always the 𝓥𝓲𝓪𝓷 case judgment, that is the basic structure doctrine. Now here another aspect is maturity of the political leadership, that is from the background story of the same thing, that is the controversy between the parliament and the judiciary. There has been another aspect that rose up, which is that at that time in 1967 to 1973, the parliament and the executive thought that there was a need for a long-term solution which could sustain the democracy of the country for a long-term view. And when in 1973 the basic structure doctrine came up by the Supreme Court, many appeals were made by the parliament to the judiciary, to the Supreme Court, to reconsider this judgment. And that's why when no reconsideration was done in this judgment, because the Supreme Court was intact on that judgment, and that's why the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act came up. But again in 1980, in Minerva Mills case, the Supreme Court held the basic structure doctrine, and that's how the basic structure doctrine came up to be identified by all the people, recognized by all the institutions and the people of the country. Another thing is that the ideas of all those leaders who wrote the constitution, who were part of the Constituent Assembly, four important things for them were there. First was the dignity of the individual, of course, the dignity and the freedom of individual. Second was the social and economic equality in the country. There is a famous quote that India would be developed only when no one sleeps with hunger. Third is that you could say unity with national integrity. Fourth is, of course, the welfare of the people. Now, these four have always been the main ideas behind the Constitution. These are the core aspects of the Constitution, and that's why, because of this maturity of political leadership, we have been able to sustain that Constitution without having the need to rewrite it. That's why many countries even fail to do so, and that's what we have succeeded in. Even if we have a lot of amendments, that doesn't mean that we have changed our core values, and that's what there have been a lot of debates about it between the judiciary and the parliament, but there is still another conclusion from it. What is the conclusion? Let's see. Conclusion. Now, from the whole chapter that we have seen, the thing that can be concluded is that even though there have been a lot of controversies between the judiciary and the parliament about the power to amend the constitution, but the scope of it is still a good thing. Why? Because democracy allows debates, democracy allows arguments between the people. Only then the different sections of the societies can voice out their opinions, and that's why with such good democratic system, we have been able to manage the constitution and such diverse group of people. Another thing is that, of course, there should not be much more debates than required, and that's why there have been limitations made on them as well. For example, the basic structure doctrine, that has been a limitation to Parliament's power to amend the constitution. So we can say that the Constitution of India holds the democratic politics in the country, and that's why the basic structure doctrine came up into being. So we can say that from all the chapter, the thing that we have concluded is that over all the process of evolution of the Constitution, there has been one thing that has been proved, which is that Constitution is surely a living document which has to go through a lot of evolution process. So this is all about the chapter. I've covered all the topics and subtopics, and the next chapter of this book will be covered in the further upcoming video. So stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much.